lovely to see you all here and welcome to UCL. My name is Jenny Wedgbury and I am the Learning and Access Officer for the UCL Art Museum. So I've been organising the event along with my colleague Kelly Large, who's the Public Programme Curator at the Zabludowicz collection. I have the boring task of telling you a few things around housekeeping and kind of this space and some of the kind of facilities for the conference. Just some health and safety things first. The fire exits are through this door and that door there, and the meeting point is down the stairs and it's in front of the main quad on the grass there. So I'm not expecting any fire alarms, so if that does happen, if you follow myself as one of the members of staff, and we'll go and meet there. The toilets are down on the ground floor, so if you do need them, you have to go right the way down the staircase that you came up, and they're just on the lower level there. We have Wi-Fi access over this day and tomorrow, so there are posters up at the sides there, and what you need to do if you want to access it is you go to the UCL guest Wi-Fi option on your phones or on your computers, and then you'll need to click onto a little tab at the top that says self-service, and then it'll ask you to fill out your details with your email address, and the password is museum-15. Okay, and then it'll give you a login that you can use throughout the day. Just to let you know also that we've got photography happening today. I am going to be the resident photographer, so if anyone wants, or doesn't want, their photograph taken, just let me know. I'll be taking kind of group shots and kind of trying to capture what's happening today. And we're also live streaming the symposium with the kind support of This Is Tomorrow. So it will be live streamed from up there. And so people who aren't able to be here today can watch it, and we'll also put it up onto the This Is Tomorrow website afterwards, and also represent it on the UCL Art Museum website and Zabludowicz collection. So I'm going to hand over to Kelly now, who'll give a more exciting introduction to the symposium. Thank you.
I don't know whether it's going to be more exciting. It's going to be short and sweet, I guess. So, welcome everybody to the Collecting the Emerging Symposium. I'm Kelly Large. I'm the Public Programme Curator at the Zabludowicz collection. I just want to give you a bit of context for the reason that this symposium is taking place. The symposium is a partnership between the UCL Art Museum and the Zabludowicz collection, and the reason that we have got together to organise this symposium together is because both organisations hold collections that focus on emerging and experimental art practice, but these collections come from very different contexts. The UCL Art Museum has collected work within an educational and academic context, and over around the last 100 years has built a collection of works by Slade School of Art graduates. In comparison, the Zabludowicz collection is a young pup. We're a private collection with philanthropic aims and are open to the public. And the collection was founded by the Zabludowicz family 20 years ago. And we've been focusing on emerging art from the late 20th century to the present day. Both organisations are at a stage where they are reflecting on their development. And I guess part of that reflection has been to think about what it means to be collections that have some focus on emerging art practice. The symposium coincides with the 20th anniversary of the Zabludowicz collection, and also with the reopening of the UCL Art Museum's space after extensive refurbishment. And at the moment, both organisations have exhibitions celebrating their collections of emerging practice. And within the symposium schedule, there are a number of spots to see both of these shows. Relaunch at the UCL Art Museum is viewable on both days, so pop down any time. And this evening, after the symposium, there is a chance to come up to the Zabludowicz collection to see our anniversary exhibition and a newly commissioned work by an artist. So over recent years, there has been an exponential growth in interest in emerging art and artists, and this symposium attempts to address this in some way and look at why this increased interest in emerging art practice is happening. So over the 2 days, we're going to, I guess, explore the term itself. This term emerging seems to be all-pervasive, and does it actually describe anything at all? We're going to explore the economic, critical and aesthetic value in the emerging art market, examine relationships between emerging and emergent in historical narratives, archives and taxonomies, look at how collections work with early career artists and experimental practice, and explore how ideas of emerging, emergence and nascence relates to artist practice, their education and their careers. So I guess to quickly get to the practical stuff, today there are 2 panel discussions held here in the Gustav Lecture Theatre. We will have a break between 3 and 3:30, which is a great, with refreshments down in the South Cloisters. That is also an opportunity to go and view the relaunch show. We will finish up about 5 o'clock after the second session. And then for those of you who are interested, we will be heading up to the Zabludowicz collection for a tour of the 20 years show and to experience a new immersive artwork by an artist called Laura Buckley, who's in the Zabludowicz collection. And this work is a one-night only work that has been commissioned especially for the symposium context. It takes about 20 minutes to get up to the Zabludowicz collection. We will be organising taxi transfers. So if you are interested in coming up to the Zabludowicz collection after this, then let me know during the break time so I know how many taxis to order. We're going to be tweeting throughout the day, so please do tweet as well. The hashtag is emerging. And I guess maybe the next thing for me to say is that the first session today is called Definitions. What does emerging mean in relationship to artists' careers and practices? And we have invited a fantastic group of art specialists who are going to, I guess, define what emerging means from their perspective of working with emerging artists and supporting experimental practice. Each speaker will give a short presentation followed by a moderated discussion, and then we will open out questions to you. So please do ask questions. And now I'm going to stop talking and introduce Louisa Buck, who will introduce each of the speakers and moderate the session. My feeling is that Louisa doesn't need an introduction because I'm sure most of you are familiar with her writing. She is the contemporary art correspondent for the Art newspaper and the Telegraph, and she has been a Turner Prize judge, and she's author of numerous publications that have focused on collecting contemporary art and also the British art scene. So I'm going to hand over to Louisa now.
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks, everybody. I rather like the fact we're sitting under a title saying, consider the years of each generation as we unpick the notion of emerging. We've got a very packed panel and a packed agenda, so I'm not going to burble on for too long. Just to really introduce my wonderful panellists. Firstly, who again probably need no introduction either, but I'm going to do it anyway, which is, first of all, Maitri Maheshwari, who is the Programme Director of the Zabludowicz Collection. J.J. Charlesworth, who's a writer, critic and associate editor of Art Review, and Chris Hammond, who is the founder of MOT International, a wonderful commercial gallery representing artists of all generations with bases in London and Brussels, Kirsty Ogg, curator extraordinaire and director of New Contemporaries, and Dr. Nina Perlman, who's led the UCL Collection Art Museum since 2008, which is also a curator in her own right with a specialist in public art. And as Kelly said, each of my wonderful panelists is going to give a talk of around about 10-15 minutes about their interpretation of feelings around the notion of emerging. Then we're going to have a discussion and then throw it open to you lot, so please think of lots of great questions. And first of all, let's take it away, Maitri. Thank you.
Hello, I'm guessing you can hear me. So I'm going to talk quite briefly and chose quite controversially to think about what it means to be collecting contemporary art, whether in collecting the emerging we are feeding the bottom or bottom feeders. The status of being emerging is a subset of being contemporary, which, contrary to the temporal implications of the word, is not really about the time in which the work is made, but rather its timeliness. This sense of timeliness is collectively agreed across a network of artists, curators, critics, gallerists, and collectors, and has enabled artworks made over 50 years ago to be considered relevant to our collective sense of now. While many of the following assumptions have shifted considerably in the last 10 years or so, emerging has typically been a description of scale, thought of as a subsidiary to contemporary. Emerging artists are younger or earlier in their careers and may initially work other jobs for money alongside being artists. Their style and processes are less defined, their work perhaps less concerned with high-end production values. They show in smaller institutions, galleries, artist-led spaces, which tend to program with shorter lead times and smaller production budgets. They have little critical literature around their work and often scant press coverage, mostly in specialist art journals rather than mainstream or national press. And as a consequence of this overall lack of visibility and exposure, their works command lower prices when sold and rarely have a secondary market. Emerging artists are considered unproven. Their longevity or significance art historically is unknown, and their potential as an investment something of a gamble. Emerging artists today occupy the position of the avant-garde at the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries, producing works that are considered adventurous, risk-taking or cutting-edge in their content, production, use of materials and technology, or modes of display. The almost sort of improvised nature of this way of working lends artworks a candour that allows them to stand apart and in opposition to recognised and established practices. There's a great deal of creative freedom in this position at the margins of the art world, the scope to experiment with ideas, processes without the pressure to produce for an uninitiated or critical audience. But how does an artist make the transition from being young to emerging to established? The canon of art, in some ways, is a popularity contest. In order to be exhibited, written about, or acquired, you have to be seen, and seen to be engaged and active in the art world. To be seen as an authentic persona is almost as important as seeing your work. And establishing yourself within a creative milieu or a network is vital to gaining peer esteem that will confer to your work its sense of timeliness. It is these peer groups that later get classified as movements, even since the ubiquity of the internet, which has tipped the balance in favour of younger artists. Those connected remotely have been cast in their own scene, the post-internet. It should hardly seem surprising that the visual arts are valorised by visibility. However, by inserting yourself into the art world, or even just into a network of peers, the potentially radical or oppositional possibilities of your work are diminished by the fact of its being recognised, accepted, and even desired. And your scope as an emerging artist is limited by financial concerns, as without funds, ambitions cannot grow or move forward. For some, acquiring emerging art seems like less of a commitment, although the works themselves might be more challenging, both in terms of content and conservation. Financially, they are cheaper and less of an initial outlay. There's more works available, and in the past these were considered easier to access than the works of more established artists whose galleries would be active in placing works with desirable institutions and collections. The potential financial return on the investment could also be greater. Collecting emerging art gives value and importance to something that has as yet no proven value. In this regard, it boosts the prospects of the artist by demonstrating a demand. Collecting the emerging defines the history for a future that is yet to exist. Emerging art as an investment speculates at that future. The success of the investment is contingent on the emerging artist sticking with art at all. Is the work of an emerging artist, work that they made while they were still at art school, still relevant to their practice as little as 10 years later? 10 years in a lifetime of a 30-year-old is a significant period, and much can change within it. In its initial conception, the Zabludowicz collection started out 20 years ago wanting to collect modern British art. The first work the collection acquired was a work by Ben Nicholson from 1947. This quickly changed as the would-be patrons of art saw and experienced more and found a greater affinity with the work of emerging artists, the energetic nature of the scene, and the possibility to make a significant difference. An intuitive collection, it's not focused on a medium or genre of work, but is rather motivated by emerging practices and relationships that might be formed between works within the collection. It doesn't have a specified or defined remit or methodology to its acquisitions, and as such, it's well adapted to collecting work by artists whose practice frequently shapeshift. But rather than considering the benefits of emerging art for the collector through the acquisition of individual artworks, the collection is interested in supporting the artist's practice as a whole, in which the collector takes on the role of an old-fashioned patron. In recognition of the limited exhibition opportunities for many of the artists the collection was acquiring in 2007, the collection opened a project space in a converted church in Chalk Farm. Curatorially led, exhibitions at the collection placed existing works into new contexts and into dialogue with other artists. And solo exhibitions would commission and produce new large-scale works, site-specific projects for artists to grow and expand their way of working. As the collection matured, and many of its artists matured with it, it became important to develop other pathways for yet younger artists. So artists nominated by other artist-led spaces across the UK to take part in our week-long creative mentoring masterclass could potentially also then participate in the Invites programme, in which UK-based artists without commercial gallery representation are invited to produce a short-run exhibition in a smaller project space in our gallery. Other artists might be invited to spend time researching and developing their practice on a residency in rural Finland, and as of later this year, also in the city of Las Vegas. The ideas conceived on a residency might in turn lead to new commissions or an exhibition back in London. While all of these endeavours may eventually increase the value of works in the collection, in the short term they offer emerging artists the support needed to move their practice forward and grow their ambitions and to continue to challenge our perceptions of the now.
Thank you very much. We all shunt up. The next one on the conveyor belt is JJ with his view.
Does feel like this. Right. Yes, this is the way I like talks. Brief and punchy and rapid. I'm going to try and rattle through some much looser observations and comments on the issue of whether what we're talking about when we're talking about emerging artists. So my question really for this presentation is not so much what is the emerging artist or what does that term mean, but just to step back a little bit and ask what is it that's doing the emerging, or what does the emerging? One of the things I like doing when I'm at my desk is to mess around with academic bibliographical search engines, which is something I do quite a lot at the moment. And I thought it would be fun and interesting to ask the question of a metadata set. When do people start talking about the phrase emerging artist? Now, this looks very authoritative. It is a bar graph. I put it there because it's a bar graph and it looks authoritative. But of course, this is very, very sketchy and very cursory, and it's a very much an initial kind of querying of a full text database. If you're an academic or someone who has worked in academia, you'll know that we have at our disposal these extraordinary bibliographical indexing and abstracting databases which have over the last 10-15 years been computerized, which means that searching them is a lot easier. Finding stuff in the archive, in the bibliographical archive, and in the archive of art publications, art journalism, and academic research is much easier than it used to be. So it allows you certain things you can play with. And so what I asked of one particular one, which is the Arts and Humanities Full Text Index, which is particular because it's full text. That's to say everything which is written in a set of maybe I think 300, 400, or 500 separate different periodicals, reaching back over about 40 years. I think it starts in about 1970. Is to ask, well, when does this phrase emerging artists crop up? I've already done some weeding to see whether to kind of take out some of the biggest spikes. But what's interesting is, as you can see, since the beginning of the 90s, the term is a lot more used and gains some kind of currency throughout the 90s, but certainly into the last decade. And just to kind of prove that it's not a complete statistical artifact, I also was curious about the term mid-career, because you get two things. We talk a lot about emerging artists, but then of course we have to ask ourselves, well, what else is the terminology for an artist's career? And one that does get used a lot, of course, these days is mid-career. Now, I put this up partly because, well, you can see the differences. It's perhaps the case that emerging artist is a much more live term and has a certain kind of emergence of its own, which is separate to the use of the term mid-career. These, of course, are publications which are centred on the arts, not just visual art, but generally arts and design subject. But what's interesting is, of course, that mid-career, although it doesn't kind of peak in or kind of crescendo in the way that emerging artists does, it still relatively traces some kind of growth in the use of that term. Now, of course, the point is, my kind of reasoning here is that artists have always emerged. But what this kind of suggests, perhaps for further inquiry, is that the term was not always that privileged. So it's not that artists aren't there, or don't have careers, or haven't gone through a process of validating themselves, or haven't gone through a process of becoming visible. I'm sure that term's going to be used a lot. But the term itself is a symptom. The use of the term and the growth of the term is itself some kind of symptom. That's what I would like to argue or suggest. Of course, when we're talking about terminology, we can also ask ourselves what the other terms might have been that would qualify it to describe the same thing. So, of course, younger artists gets mentioned. That gets used. We talk about younger artists, promising talents, and things like that. My hunch, and this is kind of really for discussion, but certainly the way I'm looking at this kind of way of inquiring this idea of what the emerging artist represents as a term which itself may be a symptom of something else, is that I've been looking at sort of art criticism and art journalism from, say, the 1970s. You simply don't get this term used in this way. You simply don't get the term used. You don't come across it. And I would notice if it did, because I've been reading a lot of contemporary art magazines from the 70s recently. So what we do find is other ways of talking about similar things. When I was looking at the literature, there's not very much literature actually that discusses emerging artists or the idea of the emerging artist. The term gets used a lot, but the self-conscious examination of the term is very, very rare. There are a few bits and pieces I've found in the last couple of weeks. Katie Siegel is an American critic who writes quite extensively, and I found in an article in Modern Painters back in 2007 that she was discussing. She discusses the term of the emerging artist quite extensively in a fairly critical article, and recounts the example. Going back again into art journalism, the history of art journalism, she recounts the example of the unfortunate American, or maybe he's unfortunate or unfortunate, I don't know, but the American painter Herman Cherry. I've never heard of him, so whether he's emerged is one thing. He certainly has disappeared as far as I'm concerned. But she refers to an article in Art News, the American magazine Art News from 1960, and Herman Cherry complains how already at the age of 51 he was still seen as a younger artist. And of course he kind of rather disgruntledly finally concludes that really actually when people talking about him being a promising talent, he really actually decides that what this means is that means that you have a lesser reputation. So in as much as younger artist doesn't really function, although the emergent artist tends to be young, this is really actually just a sort of an incidental aspect of what's really at stake. So it's interesting maybe that the idea that emerging artist as a term starts to develop as a way of handling a problem which isn't simply to do, or a phenomenon which isn't simply to do with people's youth or the it doesn't simply equate their youth or their age with their relationship to a career structure or a professional structure. So that's, I think, certainly why we might be looking at this term as representing a more neutral way of identifying people or identifying a certain relationship. Now, the thing is, of course, nobody ever calls themselves an emerging artist, I found. Can I get some water?
Sure.
It's a little bit like, people disparagingly call other people chavs, right? For example. But very few people call themselves chavs, right? I mean, obviously it's a pejorative term, but of course it's a relational term. It's a term whereby one person is saying the word, and the other person is the subject of the term, but wouldn't necessarily relate that term to themselves. It's not an identifier for one's own sense of position or perspective. So it leads me to ask, or I come to the conclusion, or I'm starting to kind of think about the problem of, okay, if it's not something that you call yourself, if it's something you call other people, if it's not a term which you attach necessarily to particular criteria or identifiers in those people, such as youth or their age, then what is it maybe pointing to? And I think because it's the kind of term which is difficult to interpret or to pin down, it's useful then to kind of think about what it's trying to say but can't, right? So if you use a sort of classic sort of, I don't know, Zizekian psychoanalytical use of disavowal, you may be asking yourself, well, what is it that the term emerging artist doesn't avow, doesn't make explicit, partly because of where it's being spoken from, who it's being spoken by. Now that's a kind of, for me, that's the broad theoretical problem, which is something to do with the theory of language and how people are identified through description. Now, the question then is, this is a quick big question for me. Okay, if it's the case that what I'm trying to identify when I'm thinking about this is the set of relationships between artists and something else, the artist and the thing that's giving out the name, that's addressing people as emerging artists, then what is it? I think there's two. It's fast. Oh, getting there.
Got a few minutes, yeah.
I don't always talk this fast. Right. Well, sometimes I do. I think there are two big issues which I think I want to use to kind of think about this discussion and think about other people's contributions. In reality, we have I think what this shows, this kind of graph shows, is that we have, what this points to is the evolution of an art system made up of institutions that have to, in some way, relate to the production, the presence of increasingly large numbers of practicing artists, which is, and because of that, is also doing that institution, that perspective that has to deal with the fact that there are new artists around, that there are not always the same bunch of artists doing the same bunch of things. That institution perhaps has a more distanced or opaque or detached relationship to what's being produced. Now I'll explain this. We have, let me just put another slide on. Right. Someone wants the slide back. Is there a clicker? Right. I don't even know what that is. Okay, right. Okay. Anyway. Just to kind of remind everybody, this is the number of people studying fine art as an undergraduate subject, undergraduate subject in blue, postgraduates in red from 1997 to the present day, according to the Higher Education Statistical Authority. This is not the number of exiting each year, it's the aggregate number of everybody studying. So you can see that in this period, undergraduate study in fine art, for example, has gone up by at least 1,500 of the corpus of people each year studying. What's actually more interesting is perhaps the doubling, or more than doubling, of the number of individuals studying fine art at postgraduate level. So what that is a sort of brief indicator of is the development of the user base, or the producer base, as it were. And now, of course, that wouldn't mean anything unless you kind of then ask yourself, well, how many institutions, how many players there might be in a situation that deal with all of this. And for me, I think the important, my kind of only real key observation here is to start to kind of unpick the reality of how a larger number of actors or institutional players there are who get into the business of trying to understand and to take a position on what is new in the activity of this greater body, an increasingly large body of fine art, cultural artists or cultural practitioners of one sort or another. Just as a coda to that, or sorry, as a sidebar to that, another important one aspect of the the increasingly complex relationship between the number of institutions that deal with trying to understand and to represent what is going on in terms of the new art or new artists producing, is also that there's an aspect of normalization involved. So if you think back to 30 years ago certainly, actually new artists and young artists doing something different were in many ways positioning themselves in direct opposition to the validating institutions that they encountered. So, for example, in the late 1960s and certainly throughout the 70s and into the 80s, the idea of what contemporary art was understood very differently to what it is today. Crucially, a lot of artists saw themselves in opposition to, or in radical opposition to, the institutions that were gatekeepers in one form or another to the opportunities and to the cultural economy and the broader culture that sustained artistic practice. So one background theme to this, for me, is that we see the term emerging artist emerge as, this is contention as far as I'm concerned, but we see it, this is what I'm contending, we see it emerge as the relationships between practitioners and institutions that mediate them becomes normalized. That's to say that the radical and the kind of disruptive aspects that people saw in the encounter between artists and institutions in certainly in the 1960s, then certainly into the 1970s, has become more professionalized and more normalized. I'm sure that will be touched on a lot more over the weekend. So what we then have in that after that period, or when that kind of period of radicalization subsides, I would call it de-radicalization, what you tend to see, I think, certainly in the last 10, 15 years, so probably in the last 20 years, a process of professionalization in which the relationships between new artists and institutions becomes a lot more professionalized, more formalized, and more normalized. Okay, so the actual producing the term emerging artist is the expression of institutions feeling more comfortable about dealing with young artists, and there being a more kind of sustained and integrated relationship between all of those. I'll wrap up. That's really only kind of maybe half of what can be said at this point, but I think those are the two key points, is the normalization of a situation in terms of how institutions feel comfortable relating to practitioners and vice versa, but also a large expansion of the kinds of institutions that do the business of saying that emerging artists are emerging artists. So to kind of semi-conclude, because I can see we're running out of time, these last few slides are a set of quotes I've pulled from press releases that I've received with the magazine by email, maybe over the last no more than 2 months. Okay, and in each one the term emerging pops up, and in each one the context, what that term is being used for, is fairly kind of consistent. These are all expressions of different institutions telling you that they're in the business of doing something which is enabling of the emerging artist, right? So you've got the photographic portrait part, photographers gallery, Screen International's Stars of Tomorrow. You've got commercial galleries. You've got university initiatives that showcase emerging creatives. You've got an art prize, platform for the most promising art graduates, recognised as essential reference for collectors of emerging artists. As you can see, yeah, emerging exhibitors, a gallery that maintains its dedication to emerging painters, a gallery that, along with an exciting roster of emerging and mid-career artists, including blah, 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 and so on. Hugo Boss, an award for emerging Asian artists, and so on and so on. Emerging Brazilian artists, emerging. So, in order to simply kind of point out how frequent the term is and how it is used in a particular way, which is to say, and this is exactly the point that we need to kind of, I think, kind of thrash out more closely. It's always an institution saying that other people are emerging, that it's already happening, and that all they're doing is picking up on it. Okay, and what that leaves out in that relationship between who's saying and who's speaking, who's being spoken to, is precisely the implication of the institution in regulating who is the emerging. Right? So all of these institutions, in one form or other, call out to the idea of the emerging artist as already existing, but are already implicated in the production of that term and that identity in the first place. Now that is not necessarily a cynical point to make, but it leaves unscrutinized precisely the process which is of value in that, which is how those judgments of selection, evaluation, and inclusion and exclusion happen further down the line. To conclude, obviously, if we kind of work over this idea of the emergent, there is no such thing as an emerged artist, right? I mean, there is, but there isn't, if you see what I mean. There's only people who, by that point, are involved in a negotiation with and an economy of relationships with institutions which support them. And at that point, once the art practitioner is invested and integrated into some kind of relationship with commissioning, sponsoring, and presenting institutions and patrons and collectors, they are already part of a certain kind of circulation, which is the emerged artist. I finished with a bunch of dead white men. Well, I don't think they're all dead. But leafing through my old copies of Studio, I remembered this picture, which is exactly the issue that we should be talking about, which is what is going on in here. Well, for me, it's what should be talked about. This is just a little photograph of the Selectors Committee for the John Moores Painting Prize in 1972, among which Cloud Hodgkin, R.B. Kittai, and others. Anyway, so I'll leave it there. That's what I want to talk about. I've already talked about it. I want to talk about more. Okay. Thank you.
So, next stop now is Chris Hammond.
Is that your go?
I'll just jump over.
Yeah.
I can try, yeah.
Yes,
okay. So, I'm going to speak a little bit about how the emerging, how the emerging is of any significance to a gallery and what a gallery relationship to the emerging is. For me, it's a very difficult term. I mean, in its definition, it denotes a choice to come out from behind something. I mean, which maybe the artist does decide to do. Maybe the artist does decide to emerge. But how do they become visible? I mean, I think visibility is the thing that we really need to think about. And the gallery is in the position by which it tries to make the artist visible, or even knowledge of the artist available. This is another thing. So, I mean, as a gallery, we have 4 spaces, 2 in Belgium, 2 in London. And strategically, I've looked at how galleries traditionally operate, and they tend to emerge themselves, or they tend to become more visible themselves. They grow more established, they grow bigger, they grow richer, they have a roster of artists that also grows with them. And I looked at that and felt that was an unsustainable thing, because also galleries then cease to exist, and what happens to the artist after that? You know, after the dealer has died, or after the gallerist ceases to exist. So I thought that it's also good to stick to the roots, to look at where the roots of your position start from. And MOT International started from my position firstly as an artist, then as an artist curator, and I set up a project space in order to show originally my own work, along with other colleagues, in a way to find out, one, how to become visible to the rest of the art world, and two, to find a way of exposing the artwork. And this led to my interest in curating, and then this led to my interest in having a sustainable platform for other artists and a sustainable economy, which is another part of I think, this debate that needs to be looked at in more detail, because it is very much linked, the market and the cultural economy is very much linked to how an artist emerges or how an artist becomes more visible, and why perhaps we try and, as a gallery or a representative of an artist, we try and provide knowledge about the work and about the artist in order to make this artist more visible. So we have the two spaces in Belgium. We're just about to open the newest space, and as the gallery has grown, we have started to represent more established artists, but we've also continued to look at less established artists. We're continuing to work with young, unrepresented artists in our project space in London, which is our original project space, and also in and also in our new project space in Belgium, which is our second gallery in Belgium, in Petit Sablon. This again is just to keep in contact with what's happening. Maybe the new is another form of looking at this, and maintaining a cross-generational approach to our program. As the gallery established, it established the careers of Elizabeth Price, for instance, and Laure Prevost, who have been with the gallery since the beginning, and who have become recognised through the Turner Prize, through museum exhibitions, through our exposition at the gallery, through our exposition in art fairs of their works. These are the various types of way that we make artists more visible. And I'm just wondering. What I wanted to do with the program is to provide a position for them historically as well. So, I mean, we started working with a lot of artists that work in performance, video, installation, conceptual practices that are traditionally more difficult on the market. And so we looked historically back at people practices like Ulay, at Neil Liauter, at Dennis Oppenheim, artists who in the 60s and 70s were not represented by galleries for the reason that their work was not considered to be a commercially viable option, but were exposed in museums and were given so were visible in that respect, which again is another thing that we can think about maybe later. There are two forms of visibility, one on the market and two on cultural level within museums, and are these things merging together and becoming reliant upon each other? And who feeds who? That would be something that I would like to ask maybe later. But this position I tried to create through the historic relevance of past practices and of continuing practices such as Ulay, Neil Liauter, who continue to be living artists. Also Stephen Willits is another artist that, although is known within a small local community, is not necessarily known on an international level. And also to look at how visibility is defined and at what level that visibility is set, because you may think that perhaps an artist winning the Turner Prize would give them an established level of visibility, something where we may be able to say there's a point at which an artist has fully emerged, and I think that is something that is also worth looking at. But from a gallery point of view, even something like the Turner Prize is not a big enough signifier to make fully visible an artist to the international community. We still have a long way and a lot of education to do in terms of collections, museums around the world, to be able to make visible the practice of, say, Elizabeth Price or even Laure Prevost. For instance, last week I was taking part in Frieze Art Fair in New York. We were showing a very large Laure Prevost work, which in Europe would be instantly recognizable. The artist's name would be instantly recognized. In New York, there was a lot of people who did not know her practice. The practice that they did know was a young artist called Dan Reese, who we're also showing and have just recently started to represent. And his practice has been made visible through the auctions. I mean, he has had one or two museum shows, but not as many as Elizabeth Price or Laure Prevost, for instance. But everybody wanted to know about Dan Reese and about the work of Dan Reese, and that was the artist that they knew. So it's interesting to look at how these different levels of signifiers operate in different situations: the art fair, the collectors, the institutions, and who's looking at what. and another thing that we do is also looking at the practices of older artists. And this is one of our younger artists, Beatrice Oliveretta, showing in a cell project space, which is it's just around the corner from our old gallery. But the other interest that I have is rediscovering practices that have perhaps fallen under the radar. So perhaps this is something we can also consider. Why do things disappear and re-emerge or reappear? Neil the Outer, for instance, was recognized in the 1970s for her practice, was in a number of shows in the Pompidou Center. Her visibility decreased during the 1980s, and she went into teaching, and she sustained herself through teaching, and only recently in the 2000s has she started to be rediscovered by galleries specializing in that type of work, through people like Espivizer, her gallerist in Istanbul, and more recently by ourselves. And she just had 3 or 4 major articles written about her in I think Art Review, Art Monthly, and Art Forum. So I mean, this is the first time she's actually had any critical recognition, and that was for her exhibition at MOT International recently in London. So the job of the gallery is to try and establish this visibility. I mean, necessarily an artist might choose to emerge, but what gives them, what tools do they need to be visible? I think that's something that we really need to think about. And what is the currency of that visibility? We talked a bit about the market and about how that can be established, and we talked about collecting the emerging and what that means. It could mean investment. It could mean you pay very little for a young artist, and in the hope that investment will increase 2-fold, 3-fold, 4-fold. This is the example of Dan Reese. What happened with his work is that his work went into auction very quickly. This established his name, and young galleries sold his work, not knowing necessarily who the collections were, and these collectors put the work straight into auction and made an investment on it and made a return, which encouraged other collectors to start looking at their work. So in a way, his work was built by the market. It wasn't built by the institution. What this did then do, it made the institution look at his work. So it became a signifier. The auction became the signifier for the cultural institution to then look at his work, and from that, the museum then bought his work. And they chose to buy paintings. Dan operates across painting, photography, and installation. But the museum, because of the value attached and the auction signifier, chose to buy the paintings. That's, again, something that we might want to think about and discuss later in terms of that, in terms of the emerging and what that might mean as an artist and the choice that the artist has to emerge. Also, we represent the practice of someone like Ulay, who considers himself to actually choose not to be visible at times. After his relationship with Marina Abramovich, he went very much underground. With the final action that they made together, the Great Wall of China Walk, he decided to disappear, and he took himself outside of the art world and didn't want to be exposed in any way. He never worked with a gallery, and he didn't necessarily choose to do that through political reasons, but maybe through necessity and realization of what had happened with Marina Abramovich. He decided to choose to come back into the art world and chose us as his vehicle with which to do that. And we have been, since the 3 or 4 years now, representing his practice and trying to make visible the early works that he made before he met Marina Abramovich, and also trying to retell a certain history that has been told by one half of that story. And that story is about to be exposed for the first time in Art Basel this year in a section called Feature, which is devoted to a single artist or a single position, and we'll be showing Retouching Bruises, which is a piece from 1975 that Ulay made with Charlotte Moorman, who was also a collaborator with Namjoon Pai. You might know her as the naked cellist. And together they made a very private performance in 1975, which Ulay documented on Polaroid photography. He was in a position at that time to just make performances to Polaroids, and very private performances, whereby they touched each other's bodies in a very intimate way with ink on their fingers, and it's called Retouching Bruises. They then retouched the photographs that came out instantly with their fingers and the ink, and retouched the photographs. This piece has been invisible since 1975, when Ulay decided to put it in a drawer and hide it away, and he's only just decided to show it now in 2015. So I think, again, we're talking about work and how we make it visible. We're doing this in a commercial art fair, but in probably the biggest commercial art fair in the world and the biggest arena for art viewing, arguably, in the world. Maybe Venice is slightly bigger, but certainly the actual amount of people coming through that space in the 4 days that or 5 days that it's on is possibly the highest saturation of both art professionals, public viewers, and commercial or collecting public. So I don't know how long we have. 2 minutes? Okay. So I try and, I mean, it's difficult to conclude. I don't know if I agree with this idea of the emerging and how interesting that is. I do agree with this idea of how we make visible things that are interesting, and how we educate, how the gallery will educate, or in my view, how we all start to look at. And maybe it's an idea of looking, maybe it's an idea of increasing our vision somehow, magnifying, using some sort of lens, and maybe the gallery operates as that, maybe the curator operates as another form of that, the museum operates on that level. But is the artist able to do that themselves? And that's something to think about. And where does the power lie in that? And who denotes the power, and where does the power come from in terms of why that is done? Maybe that's where I'd like to finish. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. I'm just going to get myself slightly sorted out here. Apologies in advance to all digital natives for the appalling quality of some of the images you're going to see on screen. I'm just going to give you a bit of an overview of some of the places and situations and locations that I've worked in over the past 20 years with what we are describing today as being emerging artists. And I think I just want to sort of touch on as well just how that the language has shifted around ideas of emerging. Artists weren't always emerging. At one point they were new, they were also up and coming. I did a Google search yesterday just for emerging, the term emerging, and this is what came up, one of the images that came up, and I think it kind of quite nicely describes this sense of the multiplicity of inflections and definitions that can be ascribed to the words emerging. And I think, sort of really one of the things that I've learned over the time that I've been working is that to everyone, emerging means something different. It will mean, I think probably collectively in this room, when you say an emerging artist, each one of you will have an idea of an artist, who that artist might be in their heads. There might be some overlaps, but I bet there'll be a really wide range of actually at what kind of career point and career stage people are working at. And I think emerging as a term has also kind of a lot to do with the emergence of a market, and a market for contemporary art practice, which is something that's also emerged over the last 20 years. I think it has some parallels with the idea of the emerging market, which is something that's very definitely used in business as something that can be approached speculatively, something that you can make money from. But this idea of visibility and platforms, I think, is something that's really key. I emerged from art school in Scotland in the 1990s. I was a student at Edinburgh College of Art, where a lot of this type of thing went on. It was an incredibly traditional college, and the weight of history was definitely very heavily upon our shoulders. I was in the sculpture department, and if you couldn't cast it, carve it, or weld it, it just wasn't happening. At the time that I emerged, there was really no kind of effective market for young Scottish artists in working in Scotland that didn't fit in to a very kind of particular narrative of Scottish art. One thing that we did have was studios, which I think apparently art students now don't have, or don't have very big studios anyway. So this idea of visibility and platforms is really key. There was no market, but what there were a series of artist-led spaces and initiatives around the country. You had Bank, Cubit, the legendary City Racing in London, the Collective Gallery in Edinburgh, and Transmission in Glasgow. I'm from Glasgow originally, and gravitating back to the city I was from, very quickly located myself around Transmission. And this idea of providing a platform for work to be seen on, and providing a network that artists could very definitely key into. It was an incredibly kind of democratic, flat structure. There was no hierarchy. There was no one person that ran the space. It was all led by committee, which drove the Arts Council mad because they couldn't. The bureaucratic function was such that they couldn't cope with the fact that there wasn't a single name that they could put into their database that they could address all official correspondence to. And I think, there's a really nice quote from Dave Hickey's air guitar, quoting Peter Schendal, saying, that you move to a town, you create a scene, and you turn that scene into a movement. So I think there's some sort of parallels with this idea of emergence and emerging into becoming a kind of a more established context, a kind of situation. At the time, nobody was talking about emerging artists, but we were talking more about context, location, and networks. And we were pitching work showing work on a very kind of even playing field. So you had Stan Douglas in '93, around the time that I was involved in Transmission. Stan Douglas showing alongside other artists, that were maybe less established. And I think a lot of how Transmission operated and kind of located itself was through this network connections of artists that were involved on the committee, the organising committee, going out and making connections with other artists. So as you see figures like Christine Borland, Douglas Gordon, Roger Buchanan, going out and beginning to start to show nationally and internationally, that those connections were being fed back very definitely into the city. So we have, again, in '94, you have artists like Richard Wright showing alongside Lothar Baumgarten and Claire Barclay. And of course, at that point, Richard Wright and Claire Barclay were artists that were absolutely less known. 95, we have Hannah Darboven showing alongside an artist called Kevin Henderson, who was not so well known, and has not kind of gone on to establish a practice. with, Dave Shrigley was also included in 1995. And then 96, we had a group show called 21 Days of Darkness, which brought together people like Neil Miller, Christine Borland, Glenn Brown, Simon Perrotin. We had images from Ouija as well. So it's the idea of, how you create this very, very sort of flat, open structure, very kind of open platform, very democratic, where, you're just talking about artists. You're not talking about emerging artists. You're not talking about mid-career artists. You're not talking about established artists. You're just talking about artists. And the rhetoric is really sort of maybe around how you're bringing together people from a local context, as in Scotland, a national context across the UK and internationally, and how you build those networks and those peer connections. So you have a sort of really interesting thing sort of happening around this period of the mid-90s, where you start getting a real interest in this idea of artist-led activity and new work, new work that was emerging from new geographic centres that were maybe outside of the more traditional power bases of the contemporary art market at the time, which were New York, Paris, Cologne, and London to a lesser degree. So you start getting interest from new curators like Maria Lind and Hans-Ulrich Obrist, who are coming to Glasgow, making studio visits, meeting artists, and then curating projects like Life Live, which happened at the Musée de l'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris, I love saying that, in 1997, can't resist singing a slightly silly voice. So this, again, was an overview of the artist-led activity that was happening in London at that particular time. And I think, as JJ said, it's about this process of legitimization. We could call it co-opting as well, to a degree, but very definitely it's about taking something that's been produced in one context and transferring it onto a different platform, a different context, a different location, giving it a different inflection. And, looking at that catalogue, some of the artists have gone on to continue to be significant players, have a visibility. Others have receded. And I think, again, this idea of the archive, what is visible, what stays visible, what disappears, becomes less visible, is something that's also really, really critical. So again, another example, we have we're calling it new art in Scotland at this particular moment. And again, this follows JJ's graphic that he showed of when this idea of, the emerging appears. So I worked at Norwich, in Norwich Gallery for a while. How are we doing for time? I've got 5 minutes. I'll rattle through this. And again, it was very much about mixing artists from different locations and different career stages. I think no one was still quite talking about emerging quite at this stage, but we're maybe sort of beginning to get there. While I was in Norwich, I ran an exhibition space in my flat, which is, I've sort of tried and tested method of exhibition production. And that was really sort of prompted by slight frustration that, coming from this very, very democratic structure at Transmission, that suddenly the inflection of the art school as the institution always suggested a hierarchy, that for artists working in Norwich, they were either students at the college or they were ex-students if they were still working in the city. So running the space in the flat was really about trying to sort of break apart that sort of system and create something that, again, very much sort of fed into the networks that I'd been developing over the time that I'd been working. So I think I was the director of the showroom between 1998 and 2008. And I think this is the point that we really start having the term emerging starting to emerge. Sorry, it's that you keep saying, doing something like this, it actually makes you realise how often you now say emerging or emerge in your daily life. And I think that it does coincide with the establishment of a far more vibrant commercial art market for contemporary practice, which I think kind of Chris touched on a little bit in his presentation in terms of the shifting of the position of MOT from the artist-led space to a very effective and successful commercial gallery. We have the first iteration of Frieze in 2003, the moment when life and the art world that as we know it completely changed. And I think that signified a much more complex set of relationships between artists, public and private galleries, and collectors. So, this is the sort of territory that we're now sort of having to operate in. So, at Showroom, we were commissioning individual artists or artist groups to make their first solo show in London. So again, this idea of visibility, this idea of, I suppose, newness, which we're now sort of feeling slightly nervous and anxious about. But absolutely sort of working with artists that had a track record of developing interesting work and having a certain degree of visibility again. So in some contexts, the artists that we were working with would have been seen to have been emerging, and in others they would have been seen to have emerged, or are well on their way to developing some kind of profile. So just running through the images, we've got Jim Lambie, we've got Subodh Gupta before he became a superstar, Claire Barclay and Eva Rothschild, all of whom were sort of relatively unknown in London at that time. We have some more sort of installation-based works from Richard Hughes, an artist from Australia called Bianca Hester, Olaf Bjornsdottir, and Katrin Bone down there. Oops, it isn't. Film and installation work, Sebastian Bertner, Daria Martin, two images from Matty Brown there at the bottom, and then Pilingalia Collectif, Juno Projects, Aileen Wikstrom and Sue Tompkins down there. So it's a sort of real variety of things. So I'm zooming along. So in 2009, I went to join the Whitechapel. I joined the Whitechapel Gallery as a curator, and absolutely this necessitated a kind of recalibration of my definition of what was an emerging artist. That was a very different sense of that at Whitechapel. One of the projects that I was involved with was the London Open, which was a reimagining or a reconfiguring of the Whitechapel's Open exhibition, which has been a very sort of long-established part of their programme. I won't go into too much detail about that, but just the observation is, who knew at the start of my career that open submission shows would play such a high proportion of activity? And again, how you interface with the emerging at Whitechapel is interesting. It's maybe around the edges. It's through the public programming. It's through the education department. It's maybe through things like the Artist Film International screening program of films. So we have during the time I was at the gallery, I curated Stephen Sutcliffe, Corinne Sworn, Jessica Warboys and Elizabeth Price into that program, and it was a way of bringing those practitioners into the Whitechapel's sphere of consciousness, which wouldn't necessarily happen through the main exhibition program. And of course, one of the results of this, I like to think, is Corinne being nominated and selected for the Max Mara Women's Artist Prize. So then we fast forward to 2013 to my current position, which is Director of New Contemporaries. And I'm sure you all know this, but New Contemporaries is an open submission exhibition which is open to all UK recent and current graduates. And in fact, JJ has been one of the selectors in 2003, the year of threes, the year everything changed. So it's been sponsored by Bloomberg since 2000. It's funded by ACE, and it generates a portion of its income as well from other sources. Oh dear, sorry, no, that's me going. I've had my 15 minutes. And I think, again, it's very much about providing a platform for artists that are emerging out of UK or graduating from UK art schools. And I think one of the things that's interesting about it is that it's a way of, I suppose, contextualizing those practices for the first time outside of the context of the place that it's been physically made. And it has this incredible kind of illustrious history that it's been going since 1949. It started life as young contemporaries, but again, this interesting idea of, kind of semantics and positioning. Around the 1970s, it was decided to change the name, to move away from this idea of young contemporaries, because as an acknowledgement of the fact that not everybody who was participating was in fact young. So this introduction of new is the word that is selected in the 1970s to describe this nascent moment. And I think something that's interesting that maybe come up today, but is definitely going to come up tomorrow with Ben Cranfield, I think, is this idea of what has a visibility and what has longevity. You look back through the archive of New Contemporaries, and it has this incredible roster of names, that gives this picture of the shifts and developments of art practice in Britain over the post-war period. But then, the more you scrutinise that list, you see that there's some really key names omitted alongside very familiar names. It also represents names that have lost a visibility, that have disappeared for whatever reason. They have their careers have not have not been maintained and developed over time. And I think those stories are equally interesting to tell. And I think in this sort of one of the things that I think see very kind of clearly as being our responsibility is that in this highlighting of the emerging, that we actually work with the artists that are selected each year to try and actually arm them with some of the defences or the weapons that they need to navigate this complex world that we now operate in, to give them mechanisms that will maybe allow them for the practices to become more sustainable over time, to be more robust, so that things like mentoring, studio bursaries, programming opportunities, professional development opportunities that will help them and advise them in very practical ways. How do I navigate a market? If I'm making market-ready paintings, how do I deal with that? How do I negotiate those relationships? If I don't make market-ready paintings, if I make prints that are designed to be in a big billboard, how do I continue to sort of operate and maintain a practice as an artist? So, I mean, that's sort of where I see, our kind of intervention in this kind of system as an organisation. I'm going to leave it there. Kelly asked me to address one particular issue, which I'm not going to touch on just now, but we might talk about later, just in terms of how we are maybe defining emerging and what we're looking for specifically in terms of practices, but that we can come back to that. Great, thank you.
Thank you. you two could just swap.
Yeah.
You know, musical chairs.
It's on the timer, so it should run itself. Well, it's really nice to follow all these those who preceded me. I'm going to be speaking this afternoon with my UCL Art Museum hat on, and specifically about a collection that one might say has been capturing the emerging for over 100 years or so. And I say that in as much as emerging in the context of the Art Museum at UCL could be understood to be capturing artists who are emerging from an institutional environment into a space in which there is a future audience, or there is an anticipated future audience for what they have produced. So I'm going to dedicate this sort of the time that I have just to focus on one aspect of our collection, which is a core part of our collection, the Slade Student Prize collection. And so I'll sort of run through a historic sort of overview of that, and then try and draw out some points that might help us sort of think about the issues that are relevant for collecting the emerging over the next couple of days. And there's a slideshow running in the background which will run in a loop. I'm going to mention some of the works that are in the slides, but obviously not in time with them, so just that's just a point. So going back to 1872, which is a year after the Slade was founded, the first professor, Edward Poynter, he instituted the annual prizes, and these were prizes for life painting and drawing, antique painting and drawing, and composition. And when we look at the early years, so the names that are familiar to us from the art books and from National Art Galleries collections, names such as Augustus John and William Orpen are those that are recognizable in the list of early winners. But it's very interesting to think that and to see that, for example, John, who shared the second prize for painting. This was the first prize that he won in 1898, actually with a female artist of which we know very little. Her name was Evelyn Cheston. And in the same year, the prize for figure drawing or for antique drawing was another female artist called Ethel Sharpin. And I'll pick up on that point again, revisit that point again at the end, a bit later. Poynter's successors went on to add prizes, and then the prizes took on different titles as tutors, and teaching emphasis changed. So, for example, the prize for fine art for anatomy was also referred to as Professor Thane's Prize for Anatomy, because Thane was the first professor to teach anatomy at the school. And of these prizes, the Figure Composition Painting Prize quickly became the most prestigious prize at the Slade. And it became known as the Summer Composition Competition. And this was a prize that was collected systematically from 1897 until 1966. Students were given a set title, and they would produce a large-scale composition over the summer. And these titles were commonly drawn from a religion, such as the Raising of Lazarus or the Nativity. We have in the slideshow two works that refer to this prize, one by Stanley Spencer, 1912, The Nativity, and one by Harold Cohen, The Raising of Lazarus, in 1950. But also titles refer to themes in literature and just general themes such as bathers or musicians.
When we speed up to the 1960s, so we see that prize regulations were loosened. And with size and subject no longer specified, so works increased in size, and students began experimenting with different media, and this meant different paints, different surfaces, and all of these raised issues of relating to conservation and indeed storage, and we are left with these issues and continue to have these issues today. At this time, we note in the collection that there are a lot of shaped canvases, abstract canvases, and painting on ply and objects. But this period of the 60s and 70s is significant because it was also a time when the prize fell out of favor with students. And so the stamp of official approval was sort of sat uncomfortably with the radical politics of the day, if you like. Also, it has been noted that the prize money was no longer an incentive in this sense. And so we do see that there are collecting gaps in the 60s and 70s, and these gaps are rather telling, and I'll mention something about that in the points at the end. It is also, the collecting gaps sort of stopped with a sort of a revival of the prize in the late 80s and 90s. And it's interesting to note that figurative painting still had a place in these prizes at that time as well. And there's a number of examples of this in the slide. An artist by the name of Tom Norris from 1984, a reclining nude, and a painting by Chloe Morrison of the 4 female figures from 1999, which you would have seen already here. So when we mention in these broad brushstrokes this sort of rough history, it's also worth noting a few points of things that were happening at the university at a similar time. So that we may think about these things as influencing also how we think about the emerging. While the presence of art history was here at the college well before the start of the Slade, it was only in 1965 that the university started, or the Department of Art History started awarding art history degrees. And while there were displays of works from the collections already tracing back to 1930, it was only in the 1970s that the art collections at the university could claim a space as their own, and that space is the space that we still have today. And because at the time a core component of the collection was work on paper, so the space was formed as a traditional print room in the 1970s, and that sort of went on till well into the 1990s, and it was only in the early 90s in which the space had a makeover alongside the time in which the Flaxman Gallery, which is a key heritage site, which I hope you will see whilst you're here, was also refurbished. So we have sort of a lot of things going on at that time, and including a moment in the early 90s when the collections received museum status. So there is a lot of transition in terms of how the collections are perceived internally, and this has been changing throughout the years and continues to change today. So importantly, it is, I suppose, good to note that today the relationship between the museum and the Slade is strong. I just had the note of, we got distracted by the 2-minute mark. So sort of just drawing out that time, going back, sort of there were phases where the relationship between the museum, the collection, and the art history department was strong, but the relation between the museum, the collections, and the Slade were less so, more tenuous. And it's really nice that over the last few years, with our collaborations with the Slade, that tie has been solidified again. So just to draw out quickly those points that have come up is that the systematic, what do you get when you have this systematic way of collecting? And what does it tell us about who was collected and who wasn't? So in particular with respect to work by women artists, for example. And so also, because of the way in which these works were collected, at the moment in which nobody had any foresight as to the future of these artists' career, and also not thinking about a market, because there isn't any sort of eventuality of selling these works onwards. So in this sense, although now we can say that it is popular to collect from degree shows for private collectors as well, but again, that distinction of the prize system allowing you to do that and bring the work into a context in which it was made, but also without reference to what the value is further on, is this distinction between the private collecting or indeed the national collecting of an art museum. I've mentioned gaps. The gaps are very important in terms of telling us what is happening at how artists are responding to social-political change, and in that sense, how they themselves are thinking about what it is to be emerging, what it is to have a relationship, as Deja talked about, with an institution. And luckily, and this is, I'll sort of end on this, is that luckily it wasn't just through the prize system that artworks entered into the collection. It was also through various Slade professors who collected work by artists and then by artists that they taught, and then gifted it to the collection. So in this sense, we also introduce another tier of influence, perhaps, in the conversation about how we think about how does emerging come to be identified as emerging. So we have these sort of private collections, if you like, of lecturers, of artists who have been collecting their students. And also to say that some Slade professors historically had been influential in terms of securing important commissions for students in order to push a particular agenda that they themselves might have had. And one of these examples is Henry Tonks, a Slade professor, who helped secure an important commission for a young artist called Rex Whistler, because he was interested in the revival of mural painting. And there is a story to be had on how that commission ended up back in the museum, but I will skip that because it's a sort of on a tangent. And just to end on the sense that there's lots to be said for us to unravel about this, and with the help of the Paul Mellon Centre for the Studies of British Art, we have a research grant to actually put a spotlight on the Slade collection, to actually look at that more closely and the gaps. So, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, we've certainly covered the turf here. There's a huge amount to discuss, and I think, you know, what is in no doubt, even if we all marched into this room, we knew this, is what a slippery term the notion emerging is. Is it age? Is it practice? Is it career trajectory? You know, nobody emerged before the 90s. They were new, they were young. I'm so old, I actually remember when nobody even talked about a career. You were just an artist, you know, seriously. It's become sort of C word over the last decade, but that's a whole other subject of a seminar. So I really want to just draw it back a bit. I mean, all these amazing points have been raised and not much time to cover them, but just back to the word itself, the E word. I mean, are we talking in terms of, when we actually talk about emerging, I think it's interesting, it seems to be various sort of tranches of interpretation. Are we talking about in terms of career? JJ quite firmly and rightly, I think at the beginning, said it isn't really a matter of age. Artists can emerge at all kinds of ages. But it does seem to be a career thing. It does seem to be at a point in their career where they haven't received the endorsement, whether it be institutional or market. But as has also been pointed out by Chris, that you can get institutional recognition, but still really not be on the public radar, then of course it'd be a national thing as well. Viz the artist you were showing at the Frieze. So we're all over the shop here. But I think it's really interesting to talk, just to go back a bit about career and practice, because what doesn't seem to be discussed very much is emerging practice. But actually, when Kirsty was talking about the kind of artists she was working with at the showroom, or indeed looking out for the new contemporaries, we're talking practice. I mean, of course, they're still painting, sculpture, bronze, blah, blah, all that's still being done. But there is a sense of grappling with artwork that is pushing at those boundaries. And the Zabludowicz collection as well. Looking at artists whose work isn't easily commercial, or indeed your thing. So I'm kind of burbling on here, but I just want to kind of go back to JJ, as he kicked it off, so I'll kick off with him, about can we just sort of pin this down a bit? Are we talking at all about practice as well as career at this point, or is it really just a career thing, and the notion of emerging practice isn't really within the kind of lexicon?
Well, I mean, I think that it's both, because obviously if you're talking about what's new, you're not the whole kind of economy and institutional sort of system of art doesn't simply want to repeat itself indefinitely. It can't, even if it wanted to. So at some point there is an aspect, there is an element of this which is to do with the process of detecting, championing, patronising, in the nice way of the term, what is being done that isn't what's already being done, right? But I think we have to be historically sensitive to the other aspect of it, which is that the career aspect of it has become much more kind of present, because I think, for me anyway, the professional system has become more professional, right? So a lot of the stuff that I flagged up in those slides about institutions, when I say institutions, I mean all kinds of things: film festival, gallery, museum, kind of university initiative, blah, blah, blah.
So you say institution, you cover the market with that as well?
Well, I think what we need to be, we have to be very, we have to be very careful to understand that when I say when we talk about institutions, we're not talking about museums with neoclassical columns outside the front. We're talking about all forms of organisation that have some part to play in mediating or negotiating what gets supported, right? And that can be private galleries, and it can be everything. It can be the market, whatever that is. So I do think that the way in which all those relationships have become more formal, have become more professionalised, and certainly, actually, when you talk about emerging artists as a kind of career category, the formalisation of people's professional development and the attention paid to supporting people in a certain bracket, because it's understood, a certain bracket of their careers, mostly sort of higher education, because there is this kind of general sense that certain types of person at certain types and points in their career need to be supported. That has exploded. So when Kirsty was presented, for me, when the new contemporaries, the young contemporaries before it, that and the John Moores Prize back in, say, 1970, there wasn't actually that much. There were small college-based awards and so on, and you certainly found that in a lot of art colleges. But there wasn't really, in the national context, much more in terms of a showcase and a spotlight on what was coming out of the art colleges. So what I think I was trying to get to in my kind of comments was that we need to make sense of how much bigger and also how much more complex and much more professionalised that whole situation has become, because I think that's what, for me, what produces this kind of nervous habit of talking about the emerging.
Signifiers, I think, are interesting. What signifies the emerging? Kirsty, have you got thoughts on
this? I think that, and I think the sort of the process of professionalisation, I think it's a two-part thing as well, that it's partly being caused by the fact, on one hand, that there is more money, that there's more private money coming into the system, and simultaneously, on the other hand, that there's less public money coming in, so that organisations have had to really sort of up the game in the way that they're interfacing and talking to a multiple range of stakeholders, while simultaneously having to fulfill certain kind of bureaucratic or systematic kind of functions in the way that they operate. So I think it's interesting, and I think it's this sense of professionalisation it's permeated everything. It's right at the get-go. It's in much more so in art school education now, right through to museum, kind of Tate Modern. You see it just right, kind of right across the board.
Professionalisation, meaning presentation.
Presentation, just expectation. Presentation, expectation,
degree of finish,
delivery,
and in the work as well. I
Yeah.
think, which
Yeah.
is quite interesting. I mean, I just like to bring Christian, because I think what's interesting is also, I think the corollary of that is not all young kids on the block. I mean, commercial galleries are increasingly, and you've been very much a kind of forerunner of that, are increasingly working with older generation artists. They're re-emerging them, they're rebooting them in a way, or putting a different kind of spotlight. I mean, Philip de Barlow is the obvious case, who was an much revered artist, but her market presence was absolutely zilch until she became an OAP.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's that idea of the resolution I was trying to talk about before, is that obviously in a world which is full and saturated, we have to find what is new from what is there. And in that sense, obviously we, as a gallerist, I have tried to mine the history, and I've looked at the history of my contemporary, my younger artists, to find the history that will relate to their context. And by doing that, I've found incredible practices that have been, and remarkably have been, unshown and remain invisible until we do that. And then become incredibly exciting by being exposed.
What makes an art? I mean, JJ, I think I love that you saying that no artist ever has emerged. They're always in the process. Then they've kind of emerged and they become sort of Anthony Gormley or something. I don't know. I mean, how do we sort of unpick slightly the definition about the signifiers of emerging and the signifiers of emerged? Institutional, old-fashioned sense, or broad institutional? And the market just seems crucial here in a rather depressing way.
Well,
I was going to say that in a way, from my perspective, I think these two things don't cross over in terms of emerging practice and the emergence in relation to the market. There's sort of two things that are happening sort of in parallel, and then at some point, much later on, they sort of
converge.
They converge, even though they've been going as a parallel.
What you mean, that's seem to have converged by art history?
They appear to have converged at a later date, because you also, it's very clear, even with respect to practice, even when you have an institutional collection like I've described, that there was a lot of emerging practice at the time that wasn't collected.
But you were telling a Slade story, which was figurative art to a great extent.
But that wasn't collected, but also wasn't collected because of difficulties in storage and conservation, and that whole issue that we will be talking about in the next day, about the challenges of collecting that work.
Well, so interesting that when you said that it was Dan Reese's paintings that got bought, because they were nice.
So there is a sort of conservatism that works. There is at play, even in a place which has been capturing the emerging at the point in which it has jumped out of the arts, just before it's even jumped out of the art school. So there's sort of this difficulty that we have in sort of institutionalizing emerging practice at different stages. Those are things to think about, and then you have the
pragmatics
of
emergence.
Well, I think by entering a collection doesn't necessarily end the end of the story or the establishment. It's also things languish in storage. They don't get shown for decades and forgotten about by the very nature that they are in the collection and not necessarily brought to the surface.
That can be private as well as...
Of course, in all ways. I mean, that's something to think about.
Yeah, the context of even having a collection that is, that's what we are finding, that even though the collection has its problems, it's incomplete, it was not representative of certain practices at the Slade at a particular time, the fact that it was systematic and tells you a story of what's there, but equally, as Jay mentioned, also what's not there. It's by its very existence, and the same with New Contemporaries collection, by its very existence, it helps you unravel those stories. You can unpick.
The things re-emerge from
you are able to
the contextual environment of the contemporaries. So it's what's happening now that negotiates the re-emergence of artworks or of artists or of histories that are retold, or new histories that are made as well.
But that suggests that what we're really talking about is the influence and the power and the moment in which things get chosen, given a platform, given some credibility at a given moment, because a lot of the things that you've been discussing disappeared. And well, two things. Things have emerged and then disappear. But then on the other hand, things were never emerged or were effectively sidelined, marginalized, excluded. You can use a lot of terms. But they managed to subsist or sustain themselves somehow and then are rediscovered. There's always that term. But really, it does come back to, or what are the moments of the initial mechanism that bring things into
what
visibility.
Does the emerging,
and that's you know, and I think the problem is that, of course, as I kind of see it, that term is always trying to hide its point of view. I mean, I think there is an important. I mean, I think the thing is that looking at it historically as a term, I think it's absent because 40 years ago, you know, in a situation where there's a relatively small group of, say, art students becoming artists, and a relatively small number of individuals who had access to a relatively small number of points of privilege in terms of institutions and so on, you didn't really need to be self-consciously expressing the fact that people were emerging, because they were already just talented and they were already the thing that we should be paying attention to.
That's what I was talking about earlier, saying there wasn't such a word as career.
No, I think that's right. Because either you had them or
but
you
maybe
didn't.
there was a career in the past.
But you also could
but you
teach, you
didn't have
could
to talk
also
about
do all kinds of things to exist that didn't actually need you to be dancing in the spotlight.
But I think
branding
picking
yourself
up on some of the
as an
points
emerging artist,
some of the points that have been made is that, you know, so certainly around the point at which people started, you know, students started kind of dismissing prizes and things like that. You know, giving up on the idea that there was an establishment that was your patron, and you wanted to go off and do something else. And certainly that resonates very strongly with what Kirsty's saying about the period in the mid to late 90s. Also, you are not dealing with, there's no functioning relationship between the people who kind of make careers for you and the people who want the careers, right? And what's interesting about emerging is it's, you know, the term emerging artist is it always comes back to the idea now, for me it seems to be, that it's a sort of self-conscious way of talking about the fact that someone's making the decisions. It's not us, or rather, or perhaps it is, but we don't want to say that it's us. When I talk about professionalization, I don't mean things are more slick or more glossy. I mean that the ways in which power and resources and opportunity are negotiated a lot more formal and a lot more kind of well organized than they used to be. I think that's more where
on the other hand,
there's always been gatekeepers, but now there's more.
There's more gatekeepers, and I think that there's more tension between how the gatekeeping gets done, because I mean what you've all said.
Well, you were using the word stakeholders, Kirsty. Again, we never use that. I mean, all this vocabulary, this rhetoric that we're using now, it's managerial, it's corporate, it's financial, and I think it's interesting what you pretty much ended off your talk with saying about the role in this for the artist to be able to tell his or her story, the role in which the artist has to kind of try and re-empower themselves from all this resources, stuff, recognition, validation, from all these kind of different interconnected stakeholders, and actually mentoring the artist, because it can be perhaps, I'm probably going to throw it to the floor after this, but the idea of perhaps it's a poisoned chalice for an artist to be seen as an emerging artist, or an ambivalent accolade, perhaps.
I mean, and I think, you know, for us, you know, I think again, you know, it's about this, you know, idea of responsibility as well. But you know, a lot of the work is for sale in new contemporaries, and we have to be careful. You know, there is a degree of scrutiny that we undertake when people want to buy a work, in terms of you know, finding out who they are, why they're, you know, why they're collecting, where the work's going to go, what, you know, what purpose is it going to function? Because obviously, you know, we want to.
You're nurturing the career from the get-go, aren't you?
Yeah, really? And kind of protecting the artist slightly from, you know, from being in a situation where they, you know, don't want, you know, they wouldn't necessarily be happy getting into it. You know, work has been acquired and then being sold very, very quickly afterwards, or, you know, not being looked after properly. So I think that's one of the key things as well.
Responsibility used to also be the responsibility of the collecting institution. Think about what we understand of museums, and museums are there to preserve in perpetuity artworks that have, you know, withstood some sort of test of time, that are for the good or the educational or moral benefit of a public. And you know, the kind of that aside, you know, even private collecting, it was for the kind of personal enjoyment and the personal sort of, but there is still this sense of keeping things long term, and there has been a shift in which I think correlates with this kind of management speak. It's the kind of market speak, which kind of means that the longevity of the artwork has you know, increasingly shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. So the artwork is, you know, a commodity much like anything else.
To be snapped up quickly.
Yeah. I mean, and I think, you know, in the 1990s, it was relatively easy to operate as an artist. It was, you know, in the 1990s, it was relatively easy to operate as an artist. You know, that there were certain government initiatives that meant it was possible to stay on the dole, get a little bit of extra money, you know, sort of fitting into this whole sort of idea of promoting an entrepreneurial culture. You know, now, you know, students are leaving college, they've saddled with huge debts, they're trying to develop a career while simultaneously, you know, probably having about three different jobs.
And what about their practice?
Yeah, and you know, trying to find studio time trying to find a studio that they can afford. We're living in a city that's virtually impossible for anybody to kind of live in now unless they're pretty well healed. So you know, it's incredibly difficult to kind of navigate that on top of everything else, and trying to kind of negotiate these relationships with, you know, developing relationships with other galleries, you know, whether they're private or
there's a whole
public.
spectrum of different considerations, and I'm aware there's a spectrum of different considerations probably sitting out here in the audience that we now have to throw the floor open, because I think we can sit here chewing the fat about it till the cows come home. But
the lady up there has been waving her hand. But
if you could just wait for the microphone as well.
So wave if you're there.
Oh,
there was a lady up there who's been patiently waiting, I think, so she gets first dib.
I could have shouted, but it's okay. There seems to be a big gap in the market for helping artists maintain their practice after graduation. What I've come across is a lot of organisations charging very expensive, capitalising on this. So what would you because you've spoke about artists keeping this professionalism, or where does your work fit into the market, how that kind of help that you need, but we don't seem to have that, or if we do, it's too expensive. So I think that's where a lot of artists disappear, this invisibility. I think that's what we need help on, especially in London.
Thank you.
I mean, I think this is definitely a kind of an area of need that, you know, the collection recognised a few years ago. So, you know, we do, in our own way, do sort of initiatives that are for free for young artists, that work with specifically for artists who don't have commercial gallery representation. So we do exhibitions that are just to give artists that platform and that opportunity to develop a new body of work for a show, to give them a platform, some source of visibility. You know, the kind of professional creative development, how do you kind of continue to have a sort of thriving practice when you are stuck in a dark room by yourself with no heating, trying to make work while trying to keep your fingers warm? Well, maybe you need a kind of community around you. How do you find that community if it's not there in your studio, because you don't have a studio, if you're working in your bedroom? We run kind of classes and courses for emerging artists. I think institutions have to start recognising that they have a role to play within what the emerging artist's career trajectory is. It can't simply be that you get all the kind of press headlines for the first show by this, the big new work by so and so. It has to kind of support from the bottom and allow those artists to kind of get to the point where you do get the big headline show as well. But I think that's very difficult for
current climate does not encourage that at all in any way. Yeah.
I'm just going to say to you, there's a great organisation called ArtQuest that you should check out. Check out them online. But they've got massive resources, fact sheets, information's online, and they also do lots of very kind of practical advice sessions and have been organising kind of peer mentoring sessions for artists. I mean, of course, because, you know, New Contemporaries, we address particular needs, but it's for, generally, it's for artists that have come through that filtering process of New Contemporaries already, but we're looking at ways of expanding that as well to speak more generally to artists who are, you know, kind of operating across the UK, primarily kind of located to the sites where we're either presenting the exhibition or London. So, yeah.
It's out there if you look for it.
And probably more so than in the 90s, as you mentioned.
But there are many more artists fighting for the resources.
People
so
self-organised in the 90s and found the means and the sustainability.
I mean, I think, you know, I think, you know, particularly in London now, it's difficult to self-organise now. You know, that so many studio buildings that have been lost. It's incredibly expensive to, you know, to find any kind of space to sort of live and work. You know, particularly if it's centrally. You know, when we started working in the East End, it was like this sort of...
I'm aware of time pressing on. Sorry, I'm going to stop your memory lane at this point.
I know. You can do that later.
I saw hands waving in the... Gentleman in the hat, I think. I've seen you as well.
Yeah, I was concerned about the question of the audience in the discussion, because thus far there has been a great deal of mention of artists and the artist's position, of course, you know, absolutely genuine and extremely important. There's been a lot of discussion around the market and the kind of emergence of the market, but one of the points that, in fact, it was Kirsty that mentioned it when speaking of the situation, the scenario, the scene in Scotland and elsewhere in the 1990s, and clearly what we saw at that point, certainly all over the UK, was actually the emergence of two things, I think. One, projects, i.e. work being made, work in the process of emerging itself, not work that had been made and was being exhibited, but actually new projects in the shape of installations, performances, new video works and so on and so forth, but also, just as importantly, the emergence of an audience. Is there a comment perhaps that you had on that?
Audience changes, shifts.
I know.
I mean, there's been, I think, personally, I have a living to make now, working for daily papers at art fairs, writing about collectors, writing about the market, and this is not what I went to the Courtauld Institute to study. You know, I mean, really, people are more interested in kind of art world often than they are artists, and I do think the audience has exploded. A buying audience, look at Frieze. You know, I mean, all this is the audience is much more informed. The internet has a role to play, I think, massively as well. And I think there is just generally contemporary art has entered the cultural mainstream in a way that was unthinkable 20 years ago, it seems to me.
Far more accessible.
It's far more accessible.
It has a currency in other areas as well, so that's sort of in terms of popular culture and fashion and other areas, which sort of the audience of crossover in terms of that currency is massive.
So, I mean, I think the general consensus from the panel is lots more audience, more informed audience, greater audience, and possibly that's why branding, things like emerging, career, this terminology, sort of PR speak to a greater extent.
But it is true that the term is used to address a general public that assumes that it is expecting to find out about something that's going on elsewhere. Yeah? So again, all that kind of business of where it's being said from to whom is important. I mean, I think
you see it in a lot of press releases.
Well, absolutely, but I think it's not. Let's not forget that in the 90s, it wasn't as if there wasn't any art, right? And there were institutions, and there was a network of commercial galleries, institutions, blah blah blah. You know, artists and so on who
but it
were
was tiny in comparison.
Well, whether it's tiny or not is not necessarily. I think the crucial factor is the fact that there was outside of that there was a bunch of people who wanted to do something alternate to that, or that couldn't be accommodated by that for whatever reason, and I think that's an interesting line of discussion. That they then become incorporated into something which becomes bigger to incorporate them, maybe. Is that a poisoned chalice or not? I mean, you don't want to be on the dole for the rest of your life, right? You do want to be, and certainly a lot of those artists have become very successful, and on top of that, the model of the artist run has fed into a more expanded concept of what the kind of gallery, the art institution can be, maybe. But so it's it is important to kind of recognise that there is a place that there are moments of activity and dynamic activity which feed into later a new version of what the kind of cultural system and the cultural economy of the art world can be. But what that then produces as kind of consequences, and whether those consequences have negative aspects to them, is the next issue. You know, it's sort of like, well, once we are in this highly professionalized or highly kind of formalized and organized space where the public sort of doesn't really care but is always being addressed. You know, I mean, I remember that from my period as a post-Goldsmiths artist in the late 90s. We didn't care what people thought, but we did care about what the circuit or the small audience thought about what was going on. Maybe that's only the effect of seeing it from the inside. But certainly now we do seem to be in a situation where we're having to deal with institutions that think they're addressing emerging artists or new artists or young artists, but perhaps for reasons which are not particularly to do with a kind of real key and a kind of core enthusiasm for what it is that they are doing.
And institutions perhaps care a lot more about box office than they did in the past.
I think they care about a lot of things which are extrinsic to necessarily... I mean, in his own way, Charles Saatchi supported a group of artists out of an enthusiasm, but then, and every private collector that is that is a private collector that has some kind of cultural, historical significance in retrospect, kind of comes at it with that kind of approach, I think.
Gentleman in the second row, I remember you were waving your... Were you asking one? Okay, wave. You need to get the microphone.
My question is about something which was also touched about the role of technology, because I think the point about institutional as well as market endorsement about emergence or emerging artists. Now, with the emergence of technology which allow an artist broader audience with just a Twitter or I don't know blog and all that, how does that affect the power dynamics, and has that changed, or is it still like endorsement for institutional and cultural players matter that much?
It's an interesting question. I don't know. I mean, it certainly gives. You know, you're right. It certainly gives artists the power to disseminate works much more readily. And I think, you know, one of the things that I'm really aware of is, I think, a kind of visual sense of how you present work for those platforms. You know, for smartphones, for blogs, for web pages. I think that it's become much more kind of sophisticated. But make sure you wanted to say something.
I was just going to say that I think the kind of ubiquity of technology favours people who are much more comfortable using technology. So, you know, that does push that visibility question back into the sphere of maybe people who are really, really able and apt at making themselves visible on those sort of formats that we spend our lives attached to phones and computers and the internet, and we see what's being sort of disseminated and broadcast on these platforms. So people who are able to use that technology, which, you know, let's face it, as people who grew up with it, so younger by definition, they tend to benefit more from it. They tend to get more visibility. They enter our consciousness much, much more easily than, you know, when we pick up an art journal, when we look at newspapers. You know, the other kind of forms of disseminating and learning about artists, you know, are just, you don't carry it around in your pocket.
Doesn't it privilege a certain kind of art, though?
It does privilege a certain kind of art.
Selfie-friendly art.
Yeah.
But also, thank God for Vimeo, actually. I mean, because I've been able to see so much more film and video, not in ideal circumstances, but, you know, it is interesting how certain art forms that were really marginalised. I mean, all the 90s, everybody was banging on about Charles Saatchi, but film and video were fantastic there. He never collected it, so it never hit the public eye. But now, with Vimeo and YouTube and so on, there's a way to get, if not very adequate access perhaps, but still better than nothing, a much broader way to interpret. Anyway,
we've got one more question.
One more question. We're getting very overexcited up here.
I recently opened a project space on Bethnal Green on Herald Street. And in the definition of my space, I have the words emerging and mid-career. So I wanted to comment on JJ's definition or comment on the emerging. It's it's interesting to note that the emerging comes from the institutions trying to define or point at something that is there, and they are not that they are not that familiar with. But at the same time, and it's interesting to note that these artists, they were placed years ago in direct opposition to these institutions, or they find themselves feeling in opposition to them. But me, as a space, I don't think I'm an institution. Sometimes I do feel myself in opposition to some institutions or spaces or galleries. So I don't know really where my place is here. But I think I'm trying to promote the work of these artists. I'm trying to give them a platform. I'm finding that there are much more artists than I can actually have the time or space to exhibit. And we're actually working on a program of interviews on the studios of the artists that we're gonna have a media platform for it. So probably that will help to the question of the technologies and how you can use them.
So what's your question? Sorry, because we've got to wind up soon.
So how the emerging is related to the role that I think I'm giving to these artists. So.
Can I answer that? Yeah, go on, over to you.
I think the one thing that we are in danger of kind of neglecting is the real business of what the values are that one finds and gives to new work, right? And the commitment to that any institution, whether it's a small, I think you're talking about being an institution actually. I don't think you're not an institution. It may not seem like that, but I think that any form that organises to present and to make visible, and I think this issue of making visible is really important, is part of that the system of institutions, or the play of institutions, or the game, or the interrelationship of institutions. But what we're really talking about in the end is a qualitative thing. You know, what difference does it make if it's just about power and gatekeeping? So what? Yeah. At some point, there must be some business of saying this is better, this is worse, this is what I'm going to support, this is why. And I think that I think one of my cautions about the term emerging and the kind of prevalence of the use of the term and the overuse of it, and also the kind of sort of empty and sort of not very kind of meaningful use of the term, is that it's a way of putting to one side the real business of saying this is better than this. Because this would be an art critic talking. So if I'm saying, you know, everybody can be emerging, everybody can be at some point in their career path, but that means that nobody's taking responsibility or making a claim for what's better or worse. So and I think that is the thing that has come out of an obsession with being in an institutional game and being in a market game or being in a museum game or whatever. I think it would be better if people stopped talking too much about supporting emerging art and started talking about supporting new art which is good. Or something like that, you know.
That is a very good note on which to end. So I'm going to draw a firm line there. Thank you very much to all my panel.